Good morning. Happy Friday.
Hey, Vish. How are you?
Hey, well, we are not, we're not able to hear you clearly, loud. Maybe it's a problem.
All right. And now? Now?
The last now was a little bit better. It seems like you're relaxed, sitting at the beach, and then talking to the laptop, which is like about 5 feet away. That's how I felt.
No, this is the echo from Australia.
Oh, yeah, fine now. This is better.
All right.
Hey Wim, hey Vish, thanks for joining. Let's give people some time to join because I'm almost sure there will be a bridge kind of messed up today because we changed the bridge where this meeting is happening.
Ah, really? Okay.
If people usually go to the Slack channel, they should be able to find it, I guess, right? That's what I use.
Yeah.
I always use it from the Slack channel.
Yeah, I have no idea what people do, and I can tell you it's not very clear neither what I do myself. So I always need to go back in the agenda.
Ah, I see.
Okay, so let's give a couple of minutes for folks to gather around, and we'll get started.
You're designing racks.
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry, that shouldn't have been there. I'm looking at the best practices.
I can help you if you want.
Oh yeah, you do some of these? You created something?
Yeah, I built I have an app for the nephew, right? I did a nephew thing.
Oh, you did? Oh, can you link it to me? I will definitely look at it.
I demoed it during the offsite, huh?
I'm
In
sorry,
November.
Wim.
Okay.
I know you did,
Yeah.
but many things
It's
are
easy.
happening, so.
Okay. I'll discuss.
Yeah,
what is this?
that's
what is easy? What are you guys
what I
talking
understood.
about?
LLM with RAG. So the
LLM.
ability to
AI,
Oh,
Vish,
okay.
Vish.
Right.
Oh yeah, sorry, AI. Overall.
The new hype.
The new shiny tool, exactly. Yeah, if you have something, Wim, I'm interested, absolutely.
All right.
Thank you. Okay, let's give one more minute, because anyway, well, I need Brian. Oh, Brian, you're here. Great. Hey, Brian, thank you for being there. Okay, well, hopefully people are not waiting on the other bridge. Good. Happy Friday, everyone. This is March 22nd, Working Group 3 call. So today for the agenda, I have 3 topics. I want to go through the process that I created for the release scope. I'm going to take probably 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Then the architecture, I updated the architecture. So I want to present that. And then I want to spend probably 40 minutes on cluster registration today, which is the use case that hopefully all of you have reviewed, that Brian, we will get us through, and hopefully we can move forward with this use case in R3. So anything people would like to add for today's agenda? Okay, so I'll get started with the RX scope process. So before I jump into the process, most of you probably have seen this scope planning document that I always try to maintain, and I've did a little bit of work in it a couple of hours ago to add the security content. I need still SIG 2 and 3 content, but the goal is, this is the 10,000 feet view of all the work item being discussed, hopefully in Nefio, right? I start building a little bit of the backlog here. Don't look at it, it's not necessarily finalized in terms of how I want it to look like. But then, given a lot of the work happened already with the user stories, I think in a couple of occasions, the question emerged as, what's the process? How do we go with user stories, and how do we go from them being defined to them being actually developed? So in that process document, there are 5 bullet points that are textual bullet points about what the process should look like. But then I also built that swim lane, if we can call it that way, or timeline, if we can call it that way, of what a user story owner should follow as a process for its user story to be implemented in Nephio, right? So I based it off how we've been doing things so far, like the last, I would say, couple of months, from the user story being created in a working group or somewhere, being discussed somewhere. Of course, we have defined required artifact to be supplied by that user stories. And then when all of that is mature enough, it comes to this specific group that we are today. And then that group is to some extent what I would call gate 1. Out of that presentation, either there is enough information for us to understand what is the documentation, the component architecture, and the API design of that user stories. Either we feel we don't have enough and it goes back. So that process is what we need to do to get the user story in a good enough kind of shape. Once when it's approved, if I can call it approved, then we go into the next couple of steps that these are not firm up, and this is very new when the working group 2 team is the first one going through these motions, but we break down the tasks and populate a Git board with what we believe are the development tasks for the user stories. And then we go to SIG2 and actually present the low-level task breakdown and estimation and so on. And so all the process until there is owned by SIG1 or by representative of the user story owner. Starting from this call today, where we present user stories in the call until everything is ready for SIG2 for development, this happens in collaboration with SIG2. And these things are not there by mistake, right? This is on purpose, and it has to happen. Because if it doesn't happen with the right parties, then the gates probably are not going to be met. And so with SIG2, there is that iteration of looking at the task presenting, and once we've reached a good enough stage, that's where development and testing can start, which is the piece that is supposedly owned 100% by SIG2, or at least the development efforts are owned by SIG2. And then once that's done, the release owned by SIG3, right? And so out of that gate 2 that I called it, the goal is to have a good understanding of the scope estimation to build a user story, and subsequently a user story roadmap, like how much are we going to be able to tackle through what time frame. And ultimately, as with my hat as SIG1 co-chair, I can go and look at all the user story roadmap and build a Nephio roadmap. So that's my intention. And so that's the draft of the process that I wanted to share. Open to questions. I think, Vish, you were first.
Yeah. Hey, thank you. This is cool. I've been on and off on this meeting, so I think this is the new proposal that you're making going forward, right? I think it's a great one. One other thing, how do we account for some of these POCs that are happening, and then suddenly it becomes a feature?
So that's a good suggestion, and that's probably something that doesn't fall into the user story process, but something else.
Yeah,
so
what I like about what you're sharing is, which means at some point of time, we'll be able to go off and identify developers and give it to them, so that they can go off and work on that. That will be an awesome opportunity for somebody new also, right? So I think that's why I like this. but in many cases, there are POCs happening along and suddenly they become a mainstream feature. So hopefully we want to get that back on track to follow this. It's a suggestion.
Yeah, so this is not perfect, but this is meant to show when we start with a blank page, which we've done in
Oh,
R3,
yeah.
and which we've done for all these user stories. So you can see there is quite a bit of them. My intention is that out of gate 1, I have the documentation. So I already know how to document that user stories at the end of the release. Anyway, you got it. So I'm not going to repeat, but yeah.
Okay.
But POC is a good something to capture. I'm going to take a note of it.
Yeah, because most of them that becomes a feature into the product and it gets merged with the release. So we want to be able to like, you know.
Okay, thank you. Wim?
Yeah, there was 2 things. I think, I don't know whether Bala is on the call. I didn't see him so far. But we have discussed a little bit in SIG2, and he was going to document it. That's why I'm calling him out. But on how we do it now, one comment that I was, but indeed, the task breakdown and Git board is basically what we want to do. The thing that I wanted to comment upon is estimation. In open source doesn't really work in my view. Because
no, so that's why I didn't add any estimation in there.
Yeah, scope estimation is what I was referring to. Because
okay.
So the thing is that the way so what we have been doing so far, right, is that we had almost so far I think in R1 and R2 we basically in R1 we kind of had we created 3 subgroups, right? But we were having one goal, right? So our outcome was get a call to work basically, and then do a change. So we basically had 2 user stories that we were doing, but they were all, let's say, collocated and joined up, if you will, right? R2 was mainly the radio, right? And it was also joined up, if you will, right? So in other words, we all work on one thing. I think from R3, that is changing, right? So we now started to work on multiple things in parallel, right? So that's the difference, I think, or at least how I see it for release 3 versus R1 and R2, which means that we have to do what I call a divide and conquer approach. So that means that some people will, in other words, like we were discussing on the call, we somehow will have a date in mind, right? And at some point, you will have to get a certain quality level, and the features at your board should be complete by a certain time. If you're not, you will not be in. So you will move to the next gate, right? So we'll have to come up with something along those lines, because that's the only way that we can manage this going forward, right? Because if there is too many parallel activities, there is no way to control it jointly. So in other words, what we'll have to end up doing is say to these people, okay, these are the criteria. If you don't meet them, you will fall out and you will have to do it in the next phase. So far, we have not been doing all of these type of things, but these are all type of changes we will have to start figuring out somehow, and some people will be happy or some people will not be happy with it, because what we are doing so far, if you look to R2, we kind of moved the release date, if you will, right, to accommodate, because we only had one content. But now, if let's say we have 5 or 6 parallel of these things, then maybe 3 out of 5 work or 6 work, and then we will release that, right? And then the other 3 will move to the next phase.
Right. No, I understand, and I think this is good to so that's where that right now here it looks just like one box, but we could expand it to what you're saying, Wim, and that development and texting box could be expanded to showcase the working methods of SIG2. And I didn't try to depict this, but what you're saying is that box is actually various streams per subgroups, and there is various gates in it. I mean, I would love if you would be willing to take that box and explode it into what it means for SIG2, right? But I didn't try to go to that level of detail.
Yeah, Bala was going to document it, so we need to follow up with him. Where is that on that? Because we discussed that approach a couple of weeks ago in SIG2 meeting on how we would do that, and we had different approaches.
Okay.
So I'll follow up with Bala on it. But yeah, sorry.
Okay. So then I'll task you with this, and I'll follow up with you.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's
Cool.
fair.
Thanks, Wim. Ravi.
Just a quick comment on this. I mean, everything, the stages look pretty self-explanatory, except for the SIG2 presentation. Did you mean it's basically about SIG2 scoping the task and having internal discussions to before the developments? Yeah, probably.
Yes.
I don't know. Okay, you can
Yeah, it's
probably
pretty
reword
much.
it a bit.
Yes, I'm gonna try to do live, but I'm not sure I can because I have some issues right now. But it's about scope estimation. It's about sitting down with SIG2 and presenting the breakdown that was done. For me, the ultimate goal of that iteration here, like the purple iteration, is to have a well-populated Git board and have a good understanding of what can be achieved in the coming release. That's my main intent. Now, the how we get there, I don't know, but my goal is that we have some sort of a good understanding of what can be done under a specific time frame, which is why I put scope estimation, user story roadmap. Maybe it is not exactly what we can achieve, but that's at least what I have in mind.
Yeah, maybe to comment on Ravi, what we were discussing at the time, right? Because we actually have this meeting. So the idea of this meeting is actually to explain. I believe that it's not good for the people working on it that they have to explain it again. So I'm of the opinion that one explanation should do it. What has to happen though is that the Git board that represents the breakdown of the implementation will need to be reviewed by a number of people from SIG2 with specific implementation in mind, right? Because what you see is that typically the people are very focused on the use case, but we have to also fit it in, like you need to write test cases, you have to set up a test environment to accommodate for it. How are we going to validate that it works and stuff like that? So there is a number of aspects that are more specific towards SIG2 that has to be added to the board. And so if I recall what we discussed at the time on SIG2 is that the board should be filled up by the people from SIG1, but then the review and the exact breakdown and has to be reviewed together with people from SIG2 with their specific focus on that, on those aspects.
Okay. Yeah, makes sense.
Okay, sure. Okay, that's what it meant. Basically, it's a presentation of another level of deep dive kind of thing.
Yeah, so feel free to suggest if you have better wording here.
It's just a review, right? So it's SIG2 review.
It doesn't have to. Yeah, it doesn't have to be a review necessarily because see, we should work in a distributed way, right? We have too many meetings, in my view. So you just in GitHub you write an issue and you get reviews from it, and that review should result in additional task or more clarification on the task and so on and so forth, right? It doesn't have to be yet another presentation, is what I'm trying to say.
Sure. So the guys, to use the example, right? So, there's 4 use cases that ORAN has done that said, hey, we're going to put this in the bucket. They've gone back through and they've updated the Git board for this, right? So you see tasks in there that they need. And so now that stuff's ready. My preference is really that review process, whatever that is, whether it's reviewing the Git tasks or whatever, right? The issues that are there. That is owned by SIG2. That's that at that point, that's
100%.
My guess that needs to be in your realm, Wim and Tao.
But what we also need, I think, what is important, at least that's my view, is we need a lead and a sub lead somehow for these use cases, right? Because at the end of the day, someone needs to be responsible to put it together, right? And
Yeah, that's
here
what
is
we've done.
Bala.
That's what we've
Here-
done in ORAN.
yeah.
So yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, so Bala raised his hand, so he is here on the call. So thanks, Bala. Please chime in because I was not in the meeting on Wednesday, so because I was on the road, so maybe some of this has been discussed. So
Okay,
go
hey
ahead.
team, just for time management purposes, let's give 5 more minutes to this, and then I want to go in the user story review from Brian. But Bala,
Cool.
go ahead.
Thank you, Alexi. Thank you, Wim. Yeah, Wim, we started discussing this. I was going to document that. So essentially, at this point of time, we are going to do something very similar to what we did with the SIG1. Just like the way we did in release 1, we'll have a subgroups for the major items such as RAN, service assurance, observability, STK, and also the platform. And then, just like you said, Wim, I think we'll have at least one lead and one sub lead for this. And from a story breakdown perspective, we will the user stories, the wish list user stories is being maintained by Alexi and team in SIG1 in a document, and then based on the priority, probably the lead and the sub lead in that particular subgroup will work with the rest of that sub team to create stories, tasks, etc. Obviously, I'm going to help there in the board, and that particular the epics, the sub epics or stories and tasks will be linked to the main story that is created by the SIG1. So that's how we are going to manage the linkage between the actual execution tasks versus the original user story created by SIG1. And then the tasks will include everything like all the development, documentation, and testing tasks to get it to the completion. And then then we
Yeah, so Bala, I
yeah.
think what we're discussing with Wim just a second ago is that double clicking on that development and testing, you know, right now it's just one box, but double clicking on it and defining the process in that box is what you've been depicting. So that would be good to map it somewhere. So at least it's not just verbatim, it's something where we can go back to.
Yes,
And
exactly.
so,
I will create a doc. I think like Wim said, I was supposed to create a doc by now, but I slacked a bit. I will make sure that's ready by next week.
No worries. So I think I captured that as well as a as an action item. So I think we're good then.
Yes, we are good. I think this is the process we are going to follow, and then we will. Obviously, there is cross-team discussions will happen. Obviously, there are main meetings either in SIG architecture, SIG automation, where if there's cross-team dependencies, we can, and also there are common components that is defined by the platform team that's going to cross-cutting across these. I think those things will be discussed in our main meetings. So I think I'm going to document exactly what I said, and then we'll take it from there. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Bala. So it took a bit more time than expected to review that, but that's okay. I think it was good discussion.
Yeah.
So we'll see by the end if we have time to review the updated architecture diagram that I created. Else we'll keep that for later. But right now, Brian, I want to give you the floor. If you want to get us through the cluster registration user story, how do you want to go at it? Do you want me to share? Do you want to share your screen?
Yeah, it's actually Anders is going to lead it from our side. If Anders is there,
sure.
It's probably good if you can share it, Alex, because I know Anders said he had trouble with sharing from Zoom on a Mac. So
yeah, no worries. Is it good enough?
That's very good. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, all right. So the goal is not to necessarily read through the user story, right? The goal is just to share more about, I think you have some of these artifacts at the bottom. How do you know, the intent of the user stories, how you intend it to be maybe implemented, and so that way we can talk about some of the details in the call.
So I was not here last Friday. I don't know if this was presented at all last Friday. Or
no, it wasn't. No, it wasn't.
Shared. Okay. Then we go from there. So the intention with this is that, stop me if you know the context. But we see that we will need a way to register workload clusters when we have a infrastructure where we don't have the IMS part, so that we can actually manage those structures or those workload clusters. And the intention with register them is to be able to use the SMO side to still, or the application deployment side to still manage applications on registered clusters. And in its simplest form, this would be a Porch KPT package that produces the same artifact in Git that we would produce when we create the cluster. And the deployment, the application deployment, network function deployment wouldn't really see a difference. Then exactly how that looks, we don't know. We have in parallel, we are discussing the cluster deployment use cases. So they are dependent in the sense that they would produce similar or the same resources in our Git repository.
Okay. Before going further, Wim, I see you have a question.
Yes.
I think we do that today, right? So
What?
today
Sorry,
when
the
we
cluster
create,
registration?
yes, because we create a workload cluster object after we create a cluster, which is a result of the cluster instantiation. I think the content of that CR is not is debatable, right? So I think it's not so that has to be updated. But we do create. By the way, we don't create it in Git. We create it on the management cluster. So we register a workload cluster at the moment we create a cluster, and that is then used as a basis for NF deployments because we inject that resource inside of the packages for the NFs that are going to be deployed. So that's the current flow of or the current mode of operation, which I think is what you're asking for. I think the content of that workload cluster that we create, I think is there has to be some modification, but we do register the cluster when we create a cluster.
So then the difference here is that we have actually a way of doing that through an API some form rather than have it as a side effect of creating the cluster. But actually,
No, I mean, we
the
do.
same, right?
Yeah, so the API is what is a cluster creation for us today? It's instantiating a package variant, right? So you have a package variant, which is an API, so it creates a package, and as part of one of the resources that are in there is actually the register cluster, is actually the cluster we create is being actuated inside of the management cluster as a result of that instantiation. Is that
exactly?
So that's what I think it's done through APIs, but so I'm wondering.
It's probably a very close variant then, where we actually don't create the cluster, but only create the representation of the cluster. That
Without creating the cluster is what you're saying. Yeah.
Yes.
But what you want is basically there is already is what you're asking.
Yes.
There is already an existing cluster, and you just want to have a representation of that. Is that what you're asking?
Yes. Imagine the case where the infrastructure is managed by somebody else, and we don't have an IMS. So we cannot programmatically create a cluster, but we still want to use everything else in FEO to manage the workloads.
Okay, I call it cluster discovery. Yeah, so it's basically
There are many flavors of this. Going further down the path of discovery and brownfield and so on, where depending on what we want to do with the cluster afterwards.
Okay, I was confused. So so in other words, you're asking for there is an existing cluster in place. We want to have a representation of that.
Yes.
Okay.
But still relevant, though. I mean,
I agree with you. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, that was my clarification question.
Thank you, Wim. Isvan, please go ahead.
Most of the things that I wanted to say, it was already discussed. I just want to say that I think that we should have these two kinds of resources well separated, as it was discussed. The resource that is an entry in an inventory, basically the registered version of a cluster. It shouldn't even have a spec and a status because it is not an intent type resource. It stores data. So in my proposal that how to modify this cluster registration resource, one of the things that we should use it to have a data field instead of a spec and a status field. And that's it. That's one. The other thing is that I think we should have a third kind of cluster resource, and that is for a network function to claim that I need a cluster that fulfills these kinds of requirements, but it is out of scope for this. For completeness sake, I would really think that we should clearly document and separate these three kinds of cluster resources. Then the network function requires a cluster, then somebody needs a new cluster and give me a new cluster type of resource. We have this right now. This is the cluster API resource for a new cluster that is part of the package that we mentioned. And the third kind that we are discussing here is this cluster information resource that is not an intent. It doesn't express a desired state that will be reconciled, but it stores data. I think we should express this as in the name of the field. That's all I want. Everything else was already discussed.
Yeah, I guess the question is, can we handle those variants as properties of the cluster? Because our thinking on this use case is, if I want to, for example, deploy a workload and I want to see what clusters are available, that could be clusters that are managed by Nepio, or clusters that are just registered, or maybe other variants of clusters. And I would like to do that type of use case in a common way, so that I don't have to change. For each type, I'd have to form a different query, for example, to find out what's out there. So I guess that's kind of conceptually, we think that maybe it could be handled as properties rather than defining completely separate use cases for the different types or categories. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, there are a bunch of hand raised. I wanted to raise mine, but when I'm sharing my screen, I don't know how. So I'll let people speak, and if I need to add, I'll add at the end. So I don't know, Istvan, did you get the answer you were looking for?
I want to react to that, but Ravi, okay. So I was thinking of that question before, and I ended up with so I would support the version when, yes, we have a separate CRD for the registration type and the give me a new cluster type resource. My reason would being that there will be clusters where we have one but not the other. For example, you already talked about a controller that will do the discovery of clusters that already exist, that weren't created by Nepio. And those will create only the registration type clusters. But when you create give me a new cluster type of resource, that will probably also create as a child resource this kind of cluster info. I would call it the cluster info type resource. And it will also maintain it. So it will keep its the data that is in it up to date with the cluster that it is created. So basically, I would go even one step further. I would create something called an abstraction that is called the Nepio inventory that would store these info-like resources, like the cluster info resources. We most probably will have node set type resources, and so on and so on. And this is, I would keep them in a separate namespace, in a separate logical space, a centralized logical space, while the give me a cluster type resources belong more to one specific deployment, or not, maybe somewhere else. But so that's it, basically, that for some kind of some risk clusters, there will be only just one type. For others, there will be two types. Both types exist.
Okay. Ravi, do you want to ask your question?
Quick. I'll ask quickly. I guess we're taking a lot of time here. So one question, because this was discussed in working group 2, at that time I felt there was some ORAN scope, but looks like because we assume that there's no IMS, I'm assuming that this is purely an NFU use case, right? I mean,
we cleaned it out with respect to ORAN references because it didn't make sense. It just confused people.
Oh, okay. Yeah. And the other question is, I think it was closely related to what Shishti was asking. So you discover a cluster, and then, but what is your expectation from that inventory perspective? Because normally when we talk in ORAN scenarios, you're creating cluster with certain network function deployment in mind. But when you're discovering this kind of cluster, what does the orchestrator do with it? I mean, how does it say that, okay, now I have to deploy some network function, now I go and again kind of upgrade it with new software? What is the life cycle from that perspective?
So the assumption we have made is that the life cycle of this cluster is managed by somebody else, and that will continue in this use case. There are the use cases you can imagine where you discover a cluster to take over and continue the life cycle from Nethiel. But that would then be another use case. And another thing, I think, at least I assume that can be discussed, is that I think we will have not always administrative access to these clusters. We will have a limited access to them, adapted to deploying applications. So yeah.
So Ravi, if you're asking how, if I think this is the registry of a cluster to the cloud, right? So I think so Ravi, your question was, how does that cluster is being used? SMO is gonna, the way I'm thinking is, the ORAN spec, if you see, there is an inventory and resource pool discoveries APIs. The SMO will ask the cloud, give me the list of all your deployment managers. Deployment managers is nothing but, in this particular Kubernetes parlay, it's a list of clusters. So cloud will supply a list of clusters along with its credentials and maybe the kubeconfig details, etc., to the cloud manager, which is SMO. And at which point of time, the SMO has the list of all the clusters because it has got it through the REST call, talking to the cloud. And then it will deploy the workloads or whatever it has to do from that point onwards.
No, but this is what I'm asking. The first thing is that it is outside the scope of ORAN, right? So we don't talk about clouds or SMO, anything. This is purely an FA use case. That's what my first question was. So
yeah, so I think the answer is yes, Ravi. I want to make sure, I mean, time is going through, and I want to make sure also Wim can ask his questions, because I know there is a lot of things in Nephew already. I've been trying to put that in the chat. So Wim, if you want to, so Ravi, first, you got your answer, right, Ravi?
No, not because now Bala was bringing cloud and all. So I'm assuming I'm going with what was being said. This is purely an FA use case. It's nothing to do with ORAN as I see it, right? Okay.
Yes. Okay. Sorry, Wim, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I had two things. One is on Isti. I think I agree with Isti that we should split the inventory from the claim of a cluster. So they should be two separate entities that are related but are not necessarily the same. So one is basically claiming a cluster. The other one is identifying it's basically the inventory of the cluster, if you will. So they are two separate things. Now, I wanted to ask another question based on the conversation that was happening, is that, okay, if we do not, we know the cluster exists, but for certain workloads, you need to have for certain capabilities, and you need to understand what are all the parameters that are available on the cluster to be able to deploy a workload. So to give you an example, let's say I need a workload and I need a certain kernel module on that workload. Otherwise, I cannot install it. So we are defining a set of parameters to be able to express that. Let's say I want the workload that has that characteristics. I'm talking about the kernel module, let's say, because that's typically a difficult one. If we do not get access to the cluster itself, how would we do that?
Yeah, I think in those cases, it would have to be a prerequisite that the cluster is created to the specs you need.
And how do we know that? So that in the inventory, in the registration, we have to detail all of these parameters because we are defining those. So that means that the registration is not just the cluster, but also all its characteristics.
Yes, the
Yes.
capabilities.
Yes,
I agree.
every capability you need to understand to deploy an application, I think should be there in that inventory.
Yeah.
There
okay,
is,
because then it's more than a cluster, right? So it's basically it's a cluster plus the characteristics, if I call it, that are relevant in this context.
As I said, I can't raise my hand, so I apologize if I'm
no,
interrupting.
you can. Yeah, no, you are the chair, Alex. So go ahead. You can always interrupt in my view. So because go for it.
Okay, the only thing I want to say is twofold. So I'm bringing Aura in the picture. You can ignore it, but there is a notion of capabilities and capacities that we need to understand on a per cluster basis. And then I'm going to bring now Kubernetes ecosystem and something that we do, for instance, at Red Hat. We install what we call the node feature discovery. So maybe as part of the registration, there's a set of tools that we need to install on the registered cluster. So we can get the knowledge from a Nefio that we need with Nefio from that cluster, such as discovery of cards and or other things such as what you described, Wim. So that's the
what is important here is that we do that in a KRM way, right?
Agreed.
Yeah, so this should be done in a KRM way because I'm of the opinion that anything that we do should be expressed in KRM, and then there's a lot of things that we get out of the box for it, like all this dependency management that I was showing in the demo before, right? With very few effort, you can do all these things out of the box.
But
so
it's
if we do that,
it's exactly so node feature discovery is going to populate the status of the node, right, with all the various components that there is in there. So that's 100% KRM. But it's just things that are discovered.
Yeah, but that's not. So here I disagree, Alex. Right? So it should not be in the state. It should be its own resource.
Okay.
Because for example, so that's already. So that's where I differ from your opinion. It's KRM, but depends on how do you do it in KRM. Because let's take an example of let's say a kernel module, right? If let's say it's not there and you want it, right? Then you want to express, and this goes back to the split between inventory versus claims, right? So I use the word claim and inventory these days. So if it's not there, you want to actually ask someone to install it, right? So in other words, if you have it somewhere in the status, then you don't want that object cluster to also do the kernel instantiation. You want another entity to do that. So from that perspective, I think it's important to model these things in separate KRM objects to be able to ask individual components to do that installation and lifecycle management of that particular entity. And if we do that, I think we have a very powerful model.
Can I try something?
I agree. Sorry, go ahead, Anders.
Yeah. So listening to you guys, it almost feels like there are four things. There is, and now I'm extending beyond cluster registration. There is something declaring our intent for how to, for when we create a workload cluster. that's not part of this registration. It wouldn't be here. And then I sense that we have maybe also a spec of the things that I usually call bootstrap, which is things that need to go on the cluster for us to be able to manage the workload, like configuring extra resource. Should they also have a spec?
Yes. Yeah. In my view, yes. So Anders, maybe to give you an example, right? So you might not have seen it, but let's say we did some work on NF2 infra. One of the requirements that we had to deal with was the following. I have an empty cluster, right? It's just, let's say that we are talking about this cluster. Yeah, nothing installed, right? Just bare Kubernetes, nothing else, right? Now you go and deploy an NF, right? And the NF says, I need this kernel module, I need this SRIRV, blah, 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 right? You name 10 things, everything gets automatically installed, right?
And that's the add-on specs I was looking for.
Correct, yeah, correct. So in other words, what I would advocate that we do is that if we have for each of these resources or entities, have a KRM resource that has a spec that someone can claim and someone will fulfill, right? So that means that there is also a software component that takes care of it, right? That we can install if we need it, right? And only if we need it with that model. So then it means the NF claims the resource. That claim is then taken care of by someone who is going to take care of it and so on. And so you can build hierarchy if you want with that model. In such an environment, we can then go from basically nothing to everything we need to satisfy that NF.
And
you see?
If you...
Yeah, just one thing. Is this about cluster registration still? Because I think we're talking about things that are somewhat way beyond cluster registration here.
Yeah, yes.
It's beyond, but I think it's important also to get a bit of a sense of the overall model which we would like to get for, because each of these elements play a role on how we model them and how we go about them. That's why this conversation is important in that registration, because if you don't manage these entities in the other cluster, then somehow you need to know about them, right? And that need to know about them is different than claiming them, right? So that's why I think this is important to have this discussion so that we get kind of a consensus on the concepts behind all of this stuff.
We kind of intersecting the cluster creation and the registration, since we are using common resource models.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's why we
yeah, so maybe just one more comment, if I may, Alexis. That's why it's important that, and I agreed with Isti, is to split the creation is different than registration. So we have to think about those in two different KRMs, if you will, that they are related, but they are not the same. That's why I think it's important.
I think we have a consensus there. No, that's good. I think we have a consensus there. Thanks, Wim. Vish?
Yeah, so I think if I understand right, Wim, what you're trying to say is when you're talking about KRM, we need to specify, we want to be able to specify the intent that Nefio can understand from the package perspective and be able to go create a cluster or deploy a network function, correct? That's what I think you're trying to say, because Nefio is the automation control plane is what we're claiming. And then to Alex's point about the node feature discovery, right? Yes, somebody can still go out and specify an intent. But the way the cluster is being created, of course, every vendor will have their own distribution. In our case, we probably have ACM, we have OCP, assisted and so on the stuff. We would be able to use our node feature discovery to go and query it to see if there's existing cluster out there, which meets those kernel module requirements or any of the other claims. And we'll be able to actually use that feature to intercept those requests and be able to create. But your point is about specifying the intent in a KRM way for Nefio to consume. That's how I understood it as. Is that correct?
No, I also believe that that in your implementation you should segment them into separate KRM resources, because then you can also actuate around them. I think what you have done is good, but I think I will go beyond what you have done to make it more flexible.
Yeah, because the way I'm thinking is like, very similar to the Etsy Mano, where we had those packages and all those stuff back then, and the deployment files where we would be specifying all those deployment requirements. I see something similar in the KRM as well.
Yes.
Where you can specify that, basically, that you want this kernel module these kernel modules can be specified, right, as an intent for that.
Yes.
But how it can be up to like, the orchestrator or whoever it is, SMO, to take that, and whichever cluster provider that it is talking to, it'll need to translate that and get that information. That is how I see that in my head. It's probably achievable, what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't discuss then abstractions and stuff like that. That's then because that's yet another dimension that we should probably take into account, but let's not go there yet. Let's make it simple for now. But we should, if we do it right, we can even do abstraction. So in other words, to give an example, today we have GitOps, right? We have config sync. If you in Red Hat decide, I go for Argo, and this cluster needs Flux and the other config sync, if our model is right, we should be able to accommodate for that without you having to change anything in your package.
Yeah. So that is where things like the top level orchestrator, like SMO or somebody that is actually reading the package.
I don't think you need SMO for that necessarily, but that's yet another conversation. But what we are debating, I think, Vish, is that for each resource or each entity that we need, we should separate that. So, for example, what I'm advocating is this: a kernel module should not be a status field in a cluster. It should be a KRM resource on itself that has a reference to the cluster where it runs. You see, rather than having it as an attribute in a status field on that cluster, I would advocate to go for kernel module is a resource by itself. Right? So a resource by itself that will be referenced to the cluster on which it runs and it's used. And then if we know that, then we can claim that kernel module in this irrespective of the cluster itself, of course, referring it to the cluster. But okay, there is more hands raised, but that's in essence what I'm advocating.
Okay. Yes, I mean, I see that fitting in the infra lane. Basically, the 3 swim lanes, the infra lane is what I think currently. But yeah, we can have this discussion later. Okay. Sorry.
Yes, exactly, Vish. So if there is any comment about the low-level discussion we just had, keep that for later. We have 7 minutes. So, Karen, please go ahead with your question.
I'm actually just struggling to lower my hand because I was going to comment that maybe the lower level discussion is outside the scope of this meeting. So
yeah, so that's where we have 7 minutes to go. And first of all, Anders, Brian, thank you for coming with that user story. I think it created probably a wave of questions and answer throughout the meetings that were unexpected. I would recommend, actually not recommend, I think it needs to have, there are various things on the table right now, and I don't want people to be confused. This use case is cluster registration, nothing else. So I don't think we had the chance to really talk about the details of it, although we have a bunch of ideas. So I welcome the group to have a breakout session. I don't know how, when, and where. I can help coordinate, but we need a breakout session to discuss the thing we just spent half an hour discussing, because we need to flesh out the big picture, as Wim, you suggested. I don't think we need the big picture fleshed out to say the use case is approved, but I can't say it's approved at this point because it's not clear to me what it means based on the discussion we had. So my suggestion is let's have a breakout session to flesh out as many details as we can about the overall subject of cluster management in Nefio, and come back in this group here with, this is the first use case with cluster registration. So that would be my guidance. I don't know, Brian, Anders, if you're aligned with this suggestion. I know it's,
sounds good.
I don't want you necessarily to take on more scope on what you wanted to do, but let's have that deeper dive discussion so we can better have a context for this request of cluster registration scope.
I think it's actually necessary also to understand the cluster creation.
Yes, okay. And cluster creation is something we're doing in the ORAN working group as well. So there will be intersection and discussion has started. So we definitely need a joint forum to discuss these things.
Just a question.
Do you want us to set that up, Alex, or sorry?
I can help. Yeah, I can. Before I just go there, Karen, you have a question.
Yeah, I'm just wondering about the logistics of this, because as I understand it, the cluster creation story is approved and is being planned in for R3. So does that mean we also pull that story back out until we've had this higher level view of cluster creation? I would have thought that what would happen would be that we would say, yes, this is the discussion of what we want to do. We want to do a cluster creation. We've agreed on that. We want to do cluster registration. I don't think anybody I heard pushing back on that, particularly today. It was more about the logistics of how that works. And my understanding is that there's a need now in working group 2 and probably that working group 1, working group 2 collaboration to discuss how the bigger picture works together to make sure that we can do both creation and registration of clusters in a consistent fashion. So I'd say either we have both cluster creation and cluster registration user stories going forward for that analysis, or else neither of them goes forward.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And in this case, I would agree that both needs to go forward. Wim?
Yeah, I see. I don't think there is a dispute that we shouldn't do one or the other. I think it's both, but I think I agree that we have to. So they are related, right? So that's why it's important to have this conversation and to do it jointly, right? And I think I would advocate to do it in work group 2, right? Because that's where it's happening already for the creation. So also at the registration, but I think it's important to have this mental model and have a consensus around that. And once we have that, I think all of this becomes very easy. But we have to have the different viewpoints of different people and flush that out. So there's going to take a bit of time, I think, but there's no dispute or discussion that we shouldn't do either one or the other, at least not from my side. But I want to do it, or I have a certain mental model in mind. I'm not saying that I'm right, but at least if we do it right, I think we can accommodate, we have a very nice, and we can, let's say, use the power of KRM in its full entirety. And that I think is going to be very powerful for Nevio as well as for the whole system itself. And that's why I think it's important to have this conversation sooner than later, I think.
Yeah, so what I suggest, Wim, and I'm sorry, because now I'm going to put a little bit on you, but if you can come up with a way to depict what you have in your mind in one slide or in one diagram, and then next week we identify a meeting where we can go over cluster creation and registration with a focus of or cluster management, which would be a broader topic. Tim isn't on the call, so I don't want to say we can hijack his call on working group 2 to do so. But I'm happy to coordinate that call if it's not the working group 2 call.
Yeah, I think I'm going to document what I have in mind, right? And to have a better view with people on it. My only problem is that this week I was in Australia, so I'm just back. And next week I'm back on the road. So my problem is a bit timing. I will try to do it by Wednesday. If not, for me, the best is not next week, but the week after I'm back. And then, but I'll try to put it together and see. But I'm next week in the US, so it's going to be a bit tough for me to get it done. That's my only constraint that I have. So if that's if we do it in 2 weeks, it would be better for me because then I'm not on the road. And
understood. Yeah, understood. Understood, Wim. Karen, before we wrap it up.
Yeah, logistically, it was pointed out in my last meeting as well that on Friday next week is a public holiday in a lot of countries. So this meeting may not be as fully attended.
Yeah, Easter, right? Yeah.
Okay. So so Anders, Brian, Wim, I think we can continue offline discussion on this. And so I'm sorry, there will be a bit of a delay if that's okay with everyone. We will schedule a deeper dive on cluster overall topic in 2 weeks from now. And between now and then, I know working group 2 will have to make some progress as well, right? So is that okay with everyone? And as for that story, I think it's clear we want to tackle it in R3. So I'm fine that we just approve this user story as moving forward in terms of if there is an official step we need to add. So is everybody on board with this? Thumbs up, opinions against that?
Yeah, that sounds good.
All right, gents. So with that, sorry, we're 1 minute over. It was tough to manage that call, but it was a good call. So happy weekend, everybody, and we'll see you next week. And thank you very much, Brian Enders, for bringing that up.
Thanks, folks.
Yeah, thanks for your
Have a good
input.
one. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Good.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.